The morning sun filled the classroom with golden light, streaming through the wide windows of the Pacific Rim University. Outside, the city buzzed with life, humans and aliens walking side by side on streets that had been built for only one species just 100 years ago. Inside room 412, Professor Minho stood at the front of the lecture hall, his weathered hands gripping the edges of the podium as he looked out at his students. Minho was a man whose face told stories. Deep lines creased his forehead and around his eyes, marks left by decades of difficult decisions. His dark hair had gone mostly gray, and there was something in the way he stood that suggested his body carried memories heavier than years alone could account for. He had been a military strategist for most of his life, and even though he now taught ethics to a room full of alien species seeking entry into the Galactic Concordat, he had never quite lost the bearing of a soldier. Today's class was different from most days. The room was more crowded than usual. In the back seat sat representatives from 3 different alien species, each here to learn how humans approach the biggest questions about war and peace. There was Captain Thrag, whose body was like an insect's, hard and angular with multiple limbs that clicked softly whenever he moved. Next to him sat Ambassador Kael, a being made almost entirely of clear crystal that caught and refracted light into rainbow patterns. And near them was Heijin, a young Osean student whose smooth skin and large eyes gave her an appearance that was vaguely human-like, though nobody mistook her for one. The classroom itself smelled of chalk and the faint chemical scent that alien ambassadors sometimes gave off. There were 50 students in total, maybe more. About 40 of them were human, while the rest represented a dozen different worlds. They all came to hear Professor Minho speak about military ethics and the philosophy of war. He was famous for his lectures not because he was dramatic or entertaining, but because he had lived through what he taught. Today, Minho said, his voice calm and measured, we will discuss whether preemptive strikes against hostile civilizations can ever be morally justified. He walked to a large screen behind him and displayed a scenario. A civilization had detected another civilization building weapons. They had proof that an attack was coming. The question was simple. Should they strike first to save their own people even if it meant killing civilians? Captain Thrag raised one of his front limbs. In his world, this was how you asked to speak. Minho nodded and the alien began to make sounds that a translation device turned into words. The mathematics are clear, Thrag said. If Civilization A knows Civilization B will attack, then Civilization A must attack first. To do otherwise is to choose the death of your own people. This is not a question of morality. This is a question of survival. Ambassador Kael shifted slightly and light reflected off his crystalline body. When he spoke, his voice was calm and philosophical. But surely we must consider that aggression births aggression. If we teach the galaxy that preemptive strikes are acceptable, then we teach fear. We teach that the threat of violence justifies violence. Is this not how wars begin? Not with evil, but with fear. Several human students nodded in agreement. Minho listened to both arguments, letting them unfold like flowers opening in the sun. This was how he taught, not by giving answers, but by letting the students discover the weight of the questions themselves. A young woman named Jiwan sat in the back row, quiet and still. She had been quiet all semester. She came to class, took notes, and never raised her hand. Most of her professors had forgotten she was even there. But Minho had noticed her. He noticed that she listened differently than the other students. She didn't listen like someone gathering information. She listened like someone searching for truth they already suspected was being hidden. Jiwan's father was Kyung-soo, and he was one of the most decorated military commanders in human history. Few people knew this about Jiwan because she never mentioned it. She didn't wear it like a badge. Instead, she seemed to carry it like a weight, heavy enough to crush her if she stopped concentrating. The debate continued for another 20 minutes. Captain Thrag argued for logic and survival. Ambassador Kael argued for compassion and long-term peace. Several human students offered their own perspectives, most of them echoing arguments they had probably heard their entire lives. Minho watched and listened, making notes on a small pad he kept in his pocket. Then something happened. Jiwan stood up. The movement was so unexpected that the whole classroom seemed to pause. Everyone turned to look at her. She was a quiet girl, small and serious, with dark eyes that seemed far older than her face. She didn't raise her hand first like she should have. She simply rose from her seat. Yes? Minho said gently, giving her permission to speak. Ji-won's voice was quiet but steady, and every word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Do you mean yours or the ones we buried? The silence that followed was complete and absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The translation devices that made communication possible between human and alien seemed to amplify the quiet rather than fill it. I'm sorry, Minho said, his professional voice cracking slightly. Could you rephrase that? When you talk about preemptive strikes and survival, Ji-won said, still standing, still quiet. Which dead people are you counting? The ones your civilization saves? Or the ones we buried? Captain Thrag's limbs stopped their clicking. Ambassador Kale's crystal body seemed to dim slightly, as if he was concentrating very hard on something. Several human students exchanged confused looks, but Minho understood, or at least he thought he understood, and that understanding seemed to drain the color from his face. That's an interesting question, Minho said carefully. Perhaps you could explain what you mean. But Ji-won didn't answer. She simply sat back down and stared at her desk. She was done speaking. Everyone could sense it. She had asked her question, and now she was waiting to see if anyone would understand it. Minho dismissed the class a few minutes early. As the students filed out, he stood very still, staring at the place where Ji-won had been standing. Captain Thrag approached him, his hard body reflecting the classroom lights. What did she mean? Thrag asked. I don't know, Minho said, which was both true and false, but I think I need to find out. That evening, Minho sat in his office and pulled up files on Ji-won's family history. What he found made him understand why she had asked that question, and it made him realize that there were things he had forgotten to teach his class, things that were far more important than any philosophy or ethical theory could ever be. The university library was silent at night, a place where knowledge slept quietly on countless shelves. Ji-won walked through the restricted archives section with determination in her step. She had a key card that gave her access, a privilege few undergraduate students received. But Taesung had given her the card, and Taesung knew who her father was. Taesung knew which secrets were being kept. Taesung was the university's historian and one of the few people on staff who had actually lived through the Earth-Vex War. He was in his mid-40s now, with kind eyes and a manner that made people want to trust him. He spent most of his days in these archives, surrounding himself with history that was slowly being declassified. He had watched Ji-won grow up, watched her search for answers that nobody wanted to give her. And eventually he had decided that a young woman deserved to know the truth about her own family. Ji-won found the file under the section marked Restricted Military. Operations Earth-Vex Conflict. The date was from 117 years ago. She had been searching for these files for months, following whispers and hints, knowing they existed but not knowing where to look. Now in the soft glow of the archive's reading lights, she opened the folder and began to read. The words seemed to burn as her eyes moved across them. Reports of initial contact with the Vex, reports of attacks, reports of humanity's desperate attempts to understand an enemy that seemed to want only one thing: to consume and consume and consume. Entire cities documented as lost. Entire populations written down as casualties. Numbers so large they stopped meaning anything after a while. When you read that 5 million people died in a single day, you couldn't really understand it anymore. It was just a number. The folder contained pictures too. Images of devastated cities that had once been home to humans. Crater-marked landscapes where forests used to grow. But the deeper she read, the more the story began to change. Taesung found her there, 3 hours later, with tears running down her face. He came quietly, carrying 2 cups of hot tea, and sat down across from her without saying anything. He had known what she would find. He had guided her toward these files because she deserved to find them. They weren't just attacking us randomly, Ji-won said quietly, not looking up from the papers. Were they? No, Taesung said. Read further, she did. And as she read, the true story of the Earth-Vex War emerged from the classified documents like a secret trying to escape from darkness. Humans had discovered that the Vex weren't really the enemy. The Vex were victims. Their entire civilization was being controlled by a parasitic hive mind that lived in their neural system. The Vex individual was a slave to a collective consciousness that cared nothing for individual survival or individual choice. Every attack, every war, every killing, all of it was orchestrated by this hive mind using the Vex bodies as weapons. So what did we do? Ji-won whispered. We found a way to free them, Taesung said. Your father and people like him, they developed a plan. Not a military plan. A medical plan. A way to use precision bombing on the hive centers while protecting the Vex populations around them. It was impossible. It shouldn't have worked. But they tried. Ji-won's hands began to shake as she turned to the casualty reports. How many? 7 billion Vex died in the process, Taesung said quietly. But we saved 5 billion more. And we saved ourselves. And for the first time in history, humanity knew the real cost of choosing to save even their enemy. Footsteps echoed through the archive. Both Taesung and Ji-won looked up, startled, though there was nothing forbidden about Taesung being here. The person who appeared between the shelves was young, with the distinctive features of an ocean. It was Hae-jin, the alien student who sometimes studied here late at night. Hae-jin stopped when she saw them. Then she saw the open file on the table. The historical documents about the Vex War. Her large eyes grew wider. You're reading about the liberation? Hae-jin asked softly. Neither Taesung nor Ji-won answered immediately. Hae-jin came closer and looked at the papers. I have studied your history, she said. My people studied it too. The Oceans were friends of the Vex before they were enslaved. We watched them disappear. We thought they were gone forever. Then you gave them back their minds. You gave them back their freedom. At a cost, Ji-won said bitterly. 7 billion of them died. 7 billion of them were freed, Hae-jin corrected gently. If the hive had won, if it had spread to other worlds, the number of slaves would have been trillions. But you stopped it. And you bled for it. Taesung watched as Hae-jin sat down at the table. She didn't move to report them. She didn't seem shocked or upset. Instead, she seemed to understand exactly what was happening here. A young human girl was learning the truth about her people, about what they had done, about what they had sacrificed. Why is this hidden? Hae-jin asked. Why do your people not speak about this? Ji-won looked at Taesung and Taesung sighed heavily. Because the truth is complicated, he said. Humanity saved 2 species on that day. We saved ourselves from extinction, and we saved the Vex from slavery forever. But we killed billions in the process. And when you do something like that, when the victory is bought with that much blood, it becomes hard to celebrate. It becomes hard to even talk about it. So we hide it. We tell the official history about military victory. But we don't talk about what victory really meant. Ji-won looked back down at the papers, pictures of the Vex before and after the hive was destroyed. They looked different now, more peaceful, more individual, more alive. The files contained interviews with liberated Vex who were learning to think for themselves for the first time in their recorded history. Some of them wept with joy. Some of them wept with sorrow for everything they had lost while enslaved. This is what I should teach when I teach about your father, Taesung said to Ji-won. This is what the galaxy should understand about humanity. You are people who face impossible choices and who carry the weight of those choices forever. That is what makes you strong, not that you win wars. It is that you survive them. Hae-jin was reading through some of the documents now, her ocean eyes scanning quickly across the human writing. When she finished, she looked at both of them. I will not report this, she said simply, but I think you should tell others. I think the Galactic Concordat should know who they are learning from. They should know that Professor Minho teaches war ethics not from theory, but from experience. They should know that Ji-won's father made choices that will haunt him forever, but those choices saved billions. This is not something to hide. This is something to understand. Ji-won felt something shift inside her. For so long, she had carried her father's story like a shameful secret. But now, hearing Hae-jin speak about it with respect and understanding, she began to wonder if maybe there was another way to carry it. Not as shame, but as truth. Not as something to hide, but as something to learn from. The memorial garden existed in a place between city and nature. A carefully designed space where stone paths wound through carefully chosen plants from both Earth and the Vex homeworld. It had been built over the course of 30 years, growing slowly as each species added their contribution to the space. There were benches carved from granite. There were flowers that bloomed in colors that human eyes could barely perceive. And most importantly, there were names, millions of them, engraved on stone pillars that stretched across the garden like a forest of remembrance. Half the names were human, half were Vex. They were arranged by year, by location, by circumstance. Together they formed a record of what had been lost and what had been gained in a single terrible war that had lasted 7 years and fundamentally changed the future of 2 species. Kyung-soo walked through this garden every morning. He had been doing this for so long now that the groundskeepers knew to expect him. He would arrive at dawn, when the garden was quiet and empty except for the birds. He would walk slowly, reading names, sometimes placing his hand on a stone, sometimes simply standing still and breathing the morning air. Kyung-soo was an old man now, though he was still strong. He had been a commander during the war, which meant his hands carried the weight of millions of decisions. Some of those decisions had saved lives. Some of those decisions had ended lives. That was the nature of being a military leader. You decided, and then thousands of people lived or died based on your decision, and you carried that knowledge for the rest of your life. This morning, something was different in the garden. There was another person walking among the stones. It was a Vex. Not a hybrid or some experimental creation, but a true Vex, one of the billions who had been freed from the hive mind. This Vex's name was Zin, and she was one of the first liberated. She had spent 6 months as a slave consciousness before the hive was destroyed. But she had been conscious enough to remember what it was like before. She could remember being a person, being an individual, and then suddenly she had been a Vex again. Kyung-soo did not approach her at first. He simply watched from a distance as she moved through the garden. She walked slowly, reading names with what appeared to be great care. Sometimes she would stop and rest her hand on a stone, just as Kyung-soo did. He wondered if she was reading names of people she knew. Kyung-soo had learned over the years that every name on these stones belonged to someone who had mattered to someone else. Someone had loved each person. Someone had grieved. Eventually, Zin noticed Kyung-soo. She turned to look at him, and her large black eyes studied him with intelligence and something that might have been curiosity. Zin had learned over the past century that most humans felt uncomfortable around the liberated Vex. Humans carried guilt about what they had done. They saw the Vex and remembered the billions who had died. But Zin had learned not to take that guilt personally. She understood what had happened. She lived because of what had happened. "You come here often," Zin said in her soft, clicking voice that the translation device turned into words. "I have seen you before." Kyung-soo nodded. "Since the war ended," he said. "Every morning for 100 years, looking for someone?" Zin asked. "Looking for forgiveness," Kyung-soo said honestly. "I don't think I'll find it. But I keep looking." Zin seemed to understand this in the way that only the liberated could understand. She walked toward Kyung-soo and he had to force himself not to move back. Even after all these years, some part of his body remembered that the Vex had been an enemy. "I was enslaved for 6 months, Zin said. "During those 6 months, I killed 3,000 humans. I followed orders that I did not know I was following. When I was freed, I learned what I had done. I learned about the billions of my people who had been killed in the liberation, and I had to decide whether to hate you or whether to understand that you were trying to save both of us." "Which did you choose?" Kyung-soo asked. "Both," Zin said simply. "I hate what happened, and I understand why you did it. These two things can exist together. Hatred and understanding, grief and gratitude. This is the burden we all carry now. All of us who lived through the war. We must carry it together." They walked through the garden in silence for a while. Kyung-soo found himself telling Zin about his daughter, about how Ji-won had been born after the war, born into a world of peace that had been purchased with 7 billion lives. About how he had never known quite how to tell her the truth about what he had done. "She asked me once," Kyung-soo said, "why I never talked about my time in the war, and I told her I was protecting her from the weight of what I had done. But really I was protecting myself. I didn't want to face it either. And now?" Zin asked. "Now she knows," Kyung-soo said. "She found the files. She read about the hive mind. She read about how many people died. And instead of hating me, she's trying to understand why I did it." When they reached the center of the garden, they found there was a ceremony happening. It was not a major ceremony, just a small group of people, some human, some Vex, gathering around a new stone that was being added to the garden. Professor Minho was there, and he looked surprised to see Kyung-soo and Zin approaching together. The new stone was being dedicated to a child who had been born and died during the war. A human child. But underneath the name there were words carved in both human script and Vex script. The words said, "For the ones we didn't bury, Kyung-soo felt something break inside his chest. He understood what that meant. It meant that humans and Vex together were choosing to remember not just those who had died, but those who had lived because of the choice to liberate, rather than destroy entirely. After the ceremony, when the other people had left, Minho approached Kyung-soo. He looked older than before, as if reading the classified files had aged him in a single night. "Your daughter asked a question in my class," Minho said. "Do you know what she asked?" "No," Kyung-soo said, "but I think it must have been important." "She asked which dead people we were counting," Minho said. "Ours or the ones we buried? And I think I finally understand why that question matters so much. It's because we almost buried them all. We almost chose extinction for them or for us, but we didn't." Kyung-soo looked at Zin, who was reading the new stone silently. Then he looked at Minho. "The hardest part of being human," Kyung-soo said slowly, "is knowing that you survived something that others didn't survive the same way. It's knowing that your survival came at their cost. And you have to live with that. You have to carry it forever." "Yes," Zin said quietly, turning from the stone, "and that is exactly what you must teach the galaxy. Not that humans are superior, but that humans can carry unbearable weight and still choose compassion. That is your real strength." The classroom was completely full now. Word had spread through the university about what was happening in Professor Minho's ethics course. New students kept arriving, filling every seat and then standing along the walls. Humans, aliens, researchers, and observers from the Galactic Concordat all wanted to hear what was being said. Something had changed in the university's atmosphere. Something important was about to be discussed, and nobody wanted to miss it. Professor Minho stood at the front of the room, and beside him stood Commander Kyung-soo. The old military leader looked uncomfortable being here, unused to public attention, but his face showed a determination to be honest. Also present was Zin, the liberated Vex, who stood in a posture that suggested both humility and quiet strength. And in the back of the room sat Ji-won, watching everything unfold. Minho began to speak, and his voice was different from before. It was not the voice of someone reading from textbooks or philosophical theories. It was the voice of someone confessing. "I have been teaching you about war ethics for many years," Minho said, "but I realize now that I have been teaching you wrong. I have been teaching you theory and philosophy, when what I should have been teaching you is the truth, the complicated, painful, messy truth about what happens when you have to make impossible choices." He gestured to Kyung-soo. "This is Commander Kyung-soo. During the Earth-Vex War, he made decisions that saved humanity. He also made decisions that killed 7 billion people. Both of these things are true, and he has spent the last 100 years carrying both truths every single day." Captain Thrag's limbs had stopped clicking. The insectoid alien was completely still, watching and listening. Ambassador Kale's crystalline body seemed to dim slightly, as if he was collecting light, preparing to be illuminated by what would be said next. Kyung-soo stepped forward, and his old voice filled the room. He told them about the discovery of the hive mind. He told them about the moment when they realized the Vex were not truly the enemy. They were prisoners inside their own bodies. He told them about the decision to attempt liberation instead of total destruction. "We could have destroyed them," Kyung-soo said plainly. "It would have been simpler. It would have cost fewer human lives, but we tried to save them. We tried to free them from slavery. And in doing that, 7 billion of them died." He paused, and in that pause was the weight of 100 years of carrying that knowledge. "I gave the orders," Kyung-soo continued. "I calculated the coordinates for the strikes. I knew that buildings would collapse with people inside them. I knew that families would be torn apart. I did it anyway because I still believed that freedom was worth that cost. But I will never know if I was right. I will never know if those 7 billion souls agreed with my decision. I can only know that I made it and I have to live with it." The classroom was silent. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed or shifted in their seats. It was as if everyone was holding their breath. Then Hae-jin stood up from her seat. She had been sitting quietly in the middle of the room, but now she rose and walked to the front. She bowed slightly toward Kyung-soo and Zin. "My people knew the Vex before they were enslaved," Hae-jin said, her voice steady and clear. "We watched them disappear. We thought they were gone forever. We mourned them. And then one day we detected their signals again. They were waking up. They were becoming themselves again. And we learned that humans had freed them." She turned to face Captain Thrag. The Krell are planning a preemptive strike against the Velkar species, are they not? I know this because my people monitor such things. You believe the Velkar will attack you someday, so you want to strike first. To eliminate the threat, Captain Thrag's body tensed. This is strategic planning. It is not the business of this classroom. It is the business of this classroom, Heijin said firmly. Because if you had learned what humanity learned, you would know that there might be another way. The Velkar are not truly your enemy. They are slaves to a parasitic consciousness just as the Vex once were. If you attack them, you might free them. But you will also kill billions. And you will have to live with that choice for the rest of your life, just as Commander Kyung-Soo has lived with it. Captain Thrag's limbs began to click again, but this time the sound seemed uncertain, confused. What do you suggest? He asked. I suggest, Minho said, that you consider whether there is another way, whether you can study the Velkar consciousness, whether you can attempt liberation rather than annihilation. Humanity tried this path. It cost more in human lives. It was harder in every way. But it gave us peace with a species that might otherwise have been our eternal enemy. Ambassador Kale's crystalline body suddenly blazed with internal light. This changes everything I thought I understood, the alien ambassador said. I came to these classes believing that war should be avoided at all costs, that violence is always wrong. But now I see that sometimes choosing to fight, choosing to shed blood, choosing to make impossible decisions, sometimes that is the only way to prevent even greater suffering. Minho nodded. This is the understanding that humanity has had to develop. We are not proud of our wars. We do not celebrate them. We mourn them every single day. But we have learned that sometimes compassion requires violence. Sometimes saving someone means making choices that will haunt you forever. Xin spoke then, and her voice was gentle but powerful. I should hate humans for what they did during the war. I should hate Commander Kyung-Soo for every decision that led to the death of my people. But I cannot hate him because I understand why he did it, and because he carries the weight of it. Because he comes to the memorial garden every morning and remembers. Because he taught his daughter the truth instead of lying to her. This is why I do not hate him. This is why I have chosen to work with humans to build peace across the galaxy. By the end of the class, everything had changed. Captain Thrag announced that the Krell would delay their planned strike against the Velkar. They would send researchers instead. They would attempt to understand the nature of the enemy's consciousness. They would try to find another way, the way that humanity had tried with the Vex. When the students left the classroom that day, they carried with them something heavier and more valuable than any textbook could provide. They carried the understanding that true ethics were not about simple answers or philosophical purity. True ethics were about making impossible choices and then spending the rest of your life trying to understand whether you chose correctly. 6 months had passed since the revelation in Professor Minho's classroom. The change had spread quietly at first, like water finding cracks in stone, and then more powerfully like a river finding its course. The Galactic Concordat had called for a special conference to be held on neutral ground, a space station orbiting a planet that belonged to no single species. The conference was called the Council on War, Ethics, and Peace Building, and representatives from 47 different civilizations had come to attend. The hall where they gathered was vast and magnificent, built to accommodate creatures of every conceivable size and shape. There were beings of energy and beings of solid matter. There were species that communicated through sound and species that communicated through light. There were representatives from worlds that had known war, and representatives from worlds that had lived in peace for 10,000 years. And they had all come to listen to humans speak about ethics. Diplomat Park Jun stood at the center of the Great Hall, a woman in her 50s who had been chosen to lead this new council. She had been selected not because she was the most decorated diplomat or the most experienced. She had been selected because she represented something that the galaxy was beginning to understand, that humans possessed a unique capacity to survive horror and still choose compassion. We are establishing today a new council, Park Jun said, her voice carried across the hall by translation devices that made her words understandable to every species present. This council will be dedicated to one simple principle. We teach not the glory of war, but its cost. We remember not just our dead, but the dead we caused, and we carry that burden forward to prevent such choices for others. In the audience, Captain Thrag sat with his delegation. Beside him sat researchers from the Krell Collective who had spent the last 6 months studying Velkar consciousness. Their findings had shocked everyone. They had discovered what humans already knew. The Velkar were enslaved beings, controlled by a consciousness that cared nothing for individual survival. The Krell were now working with humans to develop a plan for liberation, rather than destruction. "We will not wage war against the Velkar," Captain Thrag announced to the conference. "We will attempt what humanity attempted with the Vex. We will try to free them. It will take longer. It will cost resources, but it will not cost billions of lives." A ripple of understanding moved through the assembled species. Each one was seeing themselves in humanity's experience. Each one was wondering if their conflicts could be transformed if they simply tried another way. Ambassador Kale spoke next, and his crystalline form reflected light as he moved. "For centuries, my people believed that peace could only be achieved through absolute avoidance of conflict. We were wrong. We learned from humans that sometimes the path to peace leads directly through difficulty and sacrifice. But if we make those sacrifices with the goal of liberation instead of domination, if we carry the weight of our choices instead of pretending they don't matter, then we can change the future of our galaxy." In the back of the Great Hall, Jiwon stood with her father. Kyung-soo had never wanted to be celebrated or honored for his choices during the war. But here at this conference, he was being asked to speak not as a hero, but as someone who had lived with the consequences of impossible decisions. When Jiwon's turn came to speak, she walked to the center of the hall. She was not a military commander or an official diplomat. She was simply a young woman who had grown up in the shadow of her father's secret, and who had chosen to bring that secret into the light. "I asked my professor a question," Jiwon said, speaking to the entire gathering. "I asked, 'Do you mean yours or the ones we buried?' I asked because I was angry. I was angry that my father had never told me the truth about what he had done. I was angry that the galaxy had been taught a sanitized version of history that left out the billions of people who had died." She paused, and in that pause, she looked directly at her father. Their eyes met across the Great Hall, and something passed between them: understanding, forgiveness, the acknowledgement of a burden shared. "But then I learned the real story," Jiwon continued. "I learned that my father and millions like him had faced a choice so terrible that no textbook could prepare them for it. Attack and save your own people, or attempt something harder. Attempt to free even your enemy from slavery. My father chose the harder path. Millions died, and he will carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. But because he carried it, because he was honest about it, the galaxy is now learning that there might be another way to approach conflict. That compassion might be stronger than force. That saving your enemy might be possible." The conference continued for hours. One by one, representatives from different species stood to speak about their own wars, their own terrible choices, their own understanding of what it meant to survive combat and maintain your capacity for mercy. By the end of the day, a formal document had been signed. It was called the Declaration of Compassionate War, and it outlined principles that all signatory species agreed to follow if conflict became unavoidable. The first principle was the recognition that all conscious beings deserve to be free from slavery and control. The second principle was that all participants in conflict bore responsibility for the consequences of their choices. The third principle was that the goal of any military action should be liberation or protection, never domination or revenge. As the sun set over the space station, Jim-Won walked with her father to a viewing platform that overlooked the planet below. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the world rotate slowly. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," Kyung-soo said finally. "I should have trusted you to understand." "I understand now," Ji-won said. "I understand that you did the best you could with an impossible situation. And I understand that I have to do better than you did. I have to find ways to solve conflicts that don't require anyone to bury anyone." "Maybe you will," Kyung-soo said, "and maybe you won't. But at least now the galaxy knows what the cost of war really is. At least now they understand that humans don't fight because we are strong, but because we can survive fighting and still remain capable of building peace." In the memorial garden back on Earth, Zine placed her hand on the stone that read, "For the ones we didn't bury." Around her, both human and Vex caretakers were adding new stones to the garden. Stones from other worlds, stones representing conflicts that had been averted because someone had learned from humanity's experience, stones representing billions of lives that would not have to be mourned because someone had chosen a harder path. And in his office at the university, Professor Minho looked out the window at the city below. He saw humans and aliens walking together on streets that had been built for only one species 100 years ago. He thought about all the wars that might be prevented because a young student had asked one simple question. Do you mean yours, or the ones we buried? He thought about how sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was not weapons or strength, but the willingness to carry your own mistakes and use them to help others avoid making the same ones. He thought about how humanity had survived not because they were the strongest, but because they could survive horror and still choose compassion. And in that thought, he found something that was almost like peace.